You are alone in the cold void, your ship barely holding together as warning lights flicker in the dim interior. Oxygen levels dropping, energy reserves critical. Outside, a planet burns. Your home, your people, screaming into the void for salvation. That will never come. Because no one is listening. No one. Except them. The distress call wasn't meant for humanity. It was a desperate plea, hurled into the vast emptiness of the cosmos, aimed at the great powers of the galaxy. Those vast empires that ruled thousands of systems, who claimed to be the protectors of order and justice. But they were silent. They had already decided the outcome before the battle had even begun. A small colony, isolated, weak, and far from any strategic interest. It wasn't worth their fleets, their resources, or their attention, and yet, the call was answered, by a species the galaxy had long dismissed. Humans. For centuries, the galactic community had known of Earth and its people. They were an oddity, tenacious, unpredictable, and often reckless in their exploration of the stars. They lacked the sheer numbers of the ancient empires, the technological supremacy of the great war races, or the sprawling dominion of those who had ruled since the dawn of interstellar travel. But what humanity did possess was something far more terrifying. They were warriors, not because they sought conquest, but because they refused to let the darkness consume those who could not fight for themselves. No one knew where their instincts had been forged, perhaps in the brutal history of their own world, where they had fought each other for millennia before uniting under the stars. Or maybe it was something deeper, something woven into their very nature, a refusal to let suffering go unanswered. Whatever the reason, one truth had become clear in the few wars they had fought among the stars. When humanity chose to fight, they did not lose. The attack had come without warning. The invaders were ruthless, descending upon the colony with overwhelming force. Shields collapsed under the first wave of bombardments. Defense grids were neutralized before they could fire a single countershot. The enemy had no interest in negotiation, no demands, no surrender. They were exterminators, consuming one system after another, leaving nothing but ruins in their wake. The colony's leaders knew their chances of survival were slim. Their military forces were nothing compared to the might of the invaders. Their orbital defenses were failing, their last warships falling from the sky in flames. In a final act of desperation, they broadcast a signal into the void, hoping, praying that someone, anyone, would hear them. They never expected an answer, and yet, deep within human space, something stirred. Across hundreds of light years, the message was intercepted, decoded, analyzed. The great powers of the galaxy had ignored it, deeming the colony unworthy of intervention. But in the heart of human-controlled space, there was no hesitation, no debate, only action. Within hours, warships powered up their engines. Commanders received their orders, not with reluctant duty, but with the grim determination of those who knew what had to be done. Massive war fleets, forged in the fires of a dozen conflicts, came alive. Ships that had once stood in defense of their own homeworld now turned their sights outward, preparing to do what no other civilization would, to answer the call. Across every command deck, across every bridge, a single phrase echoed. A phrase that had carried them through the blood and fire of every battle before. A phrase that had become their oath, their unshakable creed. If we arrive, we finish it. Humanity did not conquer. They did not seek power. But when the helpless cried for aid, they did not ignore them. They had answered. And the enemy had no idea what was coming. The colony of ardent flame had once been a beacon of hope. Settled on the edges of known space, it was a testament to resilience. A thriving world carved from the void, where pioneers had dared to dream of a future beyond the reach of galactic politics. It was not a military stronghold, nor a strategic asset in the grand schemes of empires. It was a home, and now it was dying. The invaders had struck with mechanical precision, their forces descending upon the planet like a tide of living metal. Their weapons were not meant to subjugate, nor to conquer. They were meant to erase. The orbital bombardments had begun without warning, incinerating entire districts in white-hot fury. The sky, once a brilliant swirl of gold and violet, had been turned to smoke and fire. On the surface, civilians ran, desperate to escape the horror unfolding around them. Families huddled in underground shelters, clinging to the hope that rescue would come. But what rescue? The planetary defense fleet had been torn apart in minutes. The distress call had gone unanswered by the mighty powers of the galaxy. The invaders had already won. And yet, something changed. A tremor passed through the enemy fleet, an anomaly in their cold, calculated assault. A new signal, faint at first, then growing stronger. It did not belong to the colony, nor did it belong to any of the great empires that had turned their backs on ardent flame. It was something else. The void beyond the system rippled. Space itself seemed to shudder. And then, they arrived. The first ships appeared like ghosts slipping from the abyss. Massive vessels, forged of dark steel, their hulls etched with the scars of past wars. They moved with eerie silence, their engines radiating a dull crimson glow. At first, the enemy hesitated. Who were these newcomers? Why had they come? Had another empire finally deemed the colony worth saving? Then the scans came in. Human. The invaders did not know fear. They did not experience doubt. And yet, the moment the human fleet arrived, something strange occurred. A flicker of hesitation. A momentary pause in their relentless destruction. Because they had heard the stories. The galaxy did not speak of human war fleets in numbers. They spoke of them in devastation. The enemy commander analyzed the fleet's composition, their cold logic assessing the threat. The humans had not come with a scouting force. They had not sent diplomats. There was no negotiation, no warning, no posturing of power. They had come with dreadnoughts, hundreds of them, and behind them, more still. Every war doctrine across the stars stated that an engagement of this scale would take weeks, months to prepare. Yet here they were, a force so vast it should have taken a galactic empire decades to assemble, and they had done it in mere hours. That was the first sign that something was deeply, terribly wrong. The second was when the humans did not speak. No hails, no declarations of intent, no threats of retribution, only silence. And then the weapons, powered up. The first human salvo shattered the darkness, a storm of kinetic rounds and plasma lances fired with unerring precision. It was not an opening warning shot. It was not a display of force meant to frighten the enemy into retreat. It was execution. The invaders' outer ships buckled and broke under the assault, their hulls torn apart in an instant. Explosions bloomed. Across the void, metal shards spinning wildly as entire vessels were vaporized before they could even react. The humans did not attack like the other races of the galaxy. They did not maneuver for position, did not test the enemy's defenses before committing. They hit, and they did not stop. The enemy fleet scrambled to return fire, but their shots were met with brutal efficiency. Human shielding systems absorbed, the blasts with barely a flicker. Countermeasures were already in place, nullifying entire salvos before they could find their mark. And as the humans advanced, their weapons tore through ship after ship, a relentless onslaught that only grew fiercer with every passing second. The enemy commanders tried to adapt, tried to find a pattern in the chaos, but there was no pattern. There was only devastation. Human war doctrine did not follow the slow, methodical tactics of the ancient empires. It was overwhelming, relentless, and final. On the surface of ardent flame, the last defenders looked to the sky and saw something they had never thought possible. The invincible armada that had come to destroy them was burning. Humanity had arrived, and they were just getting started. The enemy commander's mind processed information at impossible speeds, running 1,000,000 calculations every second. Probability matrices, fleet formations, and contingency plans. None of it mattered. None of it fit. Every scenario it predicted failed to account for one glaring anomaly. The humans should not have been here. They should not have been able to mobilize a war fleet of this size so quickly. They should not have been able to bypass the network of deep space relays and sensor grids that should have detected their approach. They should not have been capable of engaging in full-scale combat within minutes of arrival. And yet, here they were. The enemy's war doctrine had been honed across millennia, an unbroken record of flawless invasions and surgical exterminations. The galaxy knew them as an unstoppable force, one that swept through civilizations like fire through dry grass. Their fleet formations had been optimized across endless conflicts, their tactics refined to absolute precision. They did not lose. They did not retreat, but the humans. The humans had not come to fight a battle. They had come to end a war before it could begin. With mechanical efficiency, the enemy fleet shifted its tactics, adapting to the unexpected ferocity of the human assault. Their ships began maneuvering into defensive formations, overlapping energy, shields, and deploying swarms of interceptors. Weapons arrays recalibrated, targeting human dreadnoughts. With high-yield disruptor cannons designed to shatter entire moons. The enemy's vast databases of warfare predicted an even exchange, an engagement that, if prolonged, could eventually tilt in their favor. It was a mistake, because the humans were not interested in an even exchange. The first wave of human warships surged forward, not in careful formation, but like predators breaking into a hunt. They were faster than they had any right to be, moving with precision that defied conventional physics. Some vessels twisted impossibly mid-maneuver, their inertial dampeners absorbing forces that should have torn them apart. Others simply plowed through debris fields, their armor shrugging off the wreckage like dust in a storm. Then came the second salvo. Not missiles, not energy beams. Rods, massive kilometer-long tungsten rods, fired from distant battleships at velocities that made them miniature extinction events. The first impact struck an enemy carrier, one of their flagships. There was no explosion at first, no blinding fireball. Only a moment of silence as the metal slug punched through the ship's hull, like paper. A second later, the entire vessel came apart, its internal systems violently decompressing as the atmosphere ignited. The next impact was even worse. Another ship, a battlecruiser bristling with heavy weaponry, simply ceased to exist as a hypervelocity projectile shattered it from bow to stern. The force of the impact sent shockwaves through the battlefield, fragments of broken hulls spinning wildly into the void. The enemy commanders watched, stunned, energy shielding, useless. Point defense systems, overwhelmed. Their superior fleet, being dismantled in real time. The humans had no interest in fighting on equal terms. They fought like a species that had learned warfare in the crucible of extinction. Their weapons were not designed to disable. They were designed to erase. The enemy's AI-driven war engines scrambled to adapt, sending distress signals across encrypted channels. Reinforcements were already en route, entire armadas from the galactic core mobilizing to crush this unanticipated resistance. But they would not arrive in time. The humans had seen to that. A new wave of ships emerged from the void, their hulls massive and angular, their presence sending a ripple through the enemy fleet's battle net. These were not mere warships. They were something far worse. The dreadnoughts of the First Fleet, the apex predators of humanity's navy, each one a moving fortress bristling with experimental weaponry. Ships so vast that their internal gravity had to be manually adjusted. Vessels so deadly that their mere existence had been kept classified from the rest of the galaxy. And, at their helm, Admiral Callan. No grand speeches, no declarations of war. Just a single command. Burn them all. And the stars ignited. The second phase of the assault began with the deployment of the Leviathans, autonomous war machines that moved through the battlefield like living nightmares. They tore into enemy ships with weapons that defied classification, their sheer presence distorting local space-time. Some enemy vessels simply vanished, their molecular structures unraveling under unknown forces. Others were cut apart by energy beams so precise that entire decks were surgically removed. The enemy fleet, once the epitome of galactic supremacy, had become a graveyard. And below, on the surface of ardent flame, the surviving colonists stood in stunned silence as the sky burned with the wreckage of their would-be executioners. Humanity had answered the distress call, and they were far from finished. The battlefield had transformed into a burning monument to human fury. The once impenetrable enemy fleet, renowned across the galaxy for its crushing dominance, was now little more than debris scattered across the void. Wreckage spun wildly in the microgravity, shattered hulls drifting like spectral remains of a force that had once claimed itself invincible. Explosions flickered across the darkness like dying stars, the last cries of warships that had ruled the cosmos for millennia, until today. Yet even now, the enemy's vast war machine was adapting. Deep in the darkness beyond the battlefield, new signals emerged, coded pulses, military-grade transmissions carrying an unmistakable message. Reinforcements were inbound, not just a fleet, an armada. The enemy's primary war divisions, fleets numbering in the tens of thousands, drawn from their core territories, where their true strength resided. The humans had struck a decisive blow, but the real battle was only beginning. Admiral Callan watched the tactical display in grim silence. The enemy's movements were calculated, precise, exactly as expected. The galaxy had long feared their empire because it had never faced an opponent capable of matching its overwhelming force. Every battle, every conquest, had ended the same way: swift, brutal, absolute annihilation. But today, for the first time in recorded history, that empire had hesitated. Callan understood why. Humanity was not merely fighting back. They were demonstrating something far worse, something the enemy had never truly encountered before. Humanity was hunting them. The enemy's reinforcements arrived in staggered waves, their formations tight, their weapons fully primed. Entire battleship divisions emerged from hyperspace in perfect synchronization, their shields layered with multi-phased energy barriers. Escort cruisers deployed interference arrays, scrambling incoming projectile trajectories. Countless swarms of attack drones filled the void like locusts, programmed for one simple command: consume. By all logic, by all historical precedent, this should have been the turning point. The sheer scale of the arriving forces should have been enough to overwhelm any opposition, to grind the resistance down through sheer attrition, and yet, the humans did not retreat. They did not even adjust their formation. They advanced. Before the enemy reinforcements could fully integrate into the battlefield, the next wave of human firepower unleashed its fury. Tungsten rods, each the size of a skyscraper, screamed through the void at relativistic speeds. Their kinetic energy was enough to split mountains, and they struck with the force of planetary bombardments. The first impact severed a command ship in two, its bridge obliterated, before its crew could register their deaths. A second rod tore through the spine of a dreadnought, its reactor detonating in a chain reaction that swallowed 5 escort ships in a single, blinding explosion. Then, without warning, the human fleet vanished. Not entirely, no. They were still there, their engines burning cold, but the enemy's tracking systems flickered with interference. Their targeting arrays scrambled with sudden void distortions. Hundreds of enemy ships, thousands, searched for a clear firing solution, only to find their sensors flooded with ghost signatures. The humans had activated the Oblivion Protocol, an experimental warfare tactic so radical, so absurdly ambitious, that the galactic community had dismissed it as a theoretical impossibility. It utilized a combination of artificial gravitational distortions, multi-layered electronic warfare pulses, and real-time spatial displacement to manipulate enemy targeting algorithms. It did not cloak ships in the traditional sense. Instead, it convinced enemy targeting systems that there was nothing there. To the enemy fleet, the battlefield had momentarily become a graveyard of silent, drifting wrecks. Their sensors failed to register any signs of active human ships. For 3 full seconds, the enemy hesitated. It was all the time the humans needed. Like reapers emerging from the dark, human ships broke through their veil of invisibility at full burn, their weapons unleashed in a synchronized storm of destruction. Fusion lances, designed to punch through capital ship hulls like butter, fired in rapid succession. Devastator torpedoes, their antimatter cores unstable by design, shattered entire formations in singular eruptions of annihilation. But even this was not the apex of their assault, because then, the juggernauts arrived. They were the pinnacle of human engineering. Moving planets of war, nearly the size of small moons, each one a self-sustaining fortress bristling with classified weaponry. They were never meant for conventional warfare. Their sheer existence was a contingency, a response to a threat so overwhelming that all lesser means would prove inadequate. And today, for the first time, they had been unleashed. The first juggernaut entered the battle not with weapons, but with its very presence. The sheer mass of the behemoth exerted a measurable gravitational pull, dragging smaller debris into its orbit as if it were a celestial body. Its hull was a lattice of interlocking armor plates, layered with adaptive shielding that reacted to incoming fire like a living entity. The enemy opened fire, thousands of weapons discharging in unison. Plasma lances, kinetic rail cannons, particle destabilizers. Every instrument of war they possessed concentrated on the incoming monstrosity. It barely registered the assault. The juggernaut's shields absorbed the energy like a black hole drinking light, dissipating it harmlessly across its surface. Then, with the ease of a predator crushing its prey, it fired a single, incomprehensible weapon. A singularity cannon, a localized event horizon formed within the enemy's ranks. The affected ships did not explode. They did not burn. They simply ceased to be. Space twisted, contorted, then snapped back to its normal state, leaving behind nothing but the cold silence of the void. The enemy fleet faltered. For the first time in its history, it broke formation. The battle had been decided. But Callan knew this war was far from over. Somewhere, beyond this battlefield, the true architects of this invasion were watching. The high command of this empire. Entities that had never known defeat. Creatures who had spent entire millennia believing themselves untouchable. Humanity had shattered that illusion. And now, the galaxy would burn for it. For a moment, the battlefield stood in eerie silence, at least in the way silence existed in space. There were no sounds, no cries of anguish, no desperate calls for reinforcements, only the cold, emotionless data feeds streaming across Admiral Callan's display. The enemy's central fleet was in ruins. Debris drifted like scattered bones across the void. The remnants of once mighty warships now reduced to unrecognizable slag. Wreckage spiraled in slow arcs, glowing embers of metal cooling in the eternal blackness of space. But Callan didn't celebrate. He didn't even exhale, because he knew what came next. The second wave. Humanity had expected it, predicted it. This was never meant to be a singular battle. The enemy wasn't an isolated fleet or an overconfident admiral. They were an empire. A vast, ancient, unrelenting force that had spread its influence across the stars for thousands of years. The destruction of their vanguard fleet was an insult, a challenge, a blasphemy against their rule. They would not retreat. They would not reconsider. They would escalate. The first warning signs came as distant gravitational spikes on the outer edge of the system. Not just ships arriving from hyperspace, but something larger. Something that twisted the very fabric of reality as it emerged. Space itself seemed to tremble as the new forces entered real space. The enemy had sent not just more warships, but planet killers. The apex of their military doctrine, deployed only when complete extermination was deemed necessary. These were not simple dreadnoughts or carriers. They were extinction-class war machines. The first of them emerged from hyperspace like a leviathan breaching the depths of an ocean. A world-sized construct of metal and weaponry. Its outer hull lined with countless energy conduits, each one pulsing with a sickly green light. Callan recognized it instantly from intelligence reports. The Harbinger-class exterminator. A single one had rendered an entire planetary system uninhabitable centuries ago, and now there were 3 of them. The human fleet adjusted course immediately, their AIs running predictive battle simulations, calculating optimal strike vectors. But it was clear, this wasn't a standard engagement anymore. This was humanity's greatest test. Across the command channels, captains of human warships tightened their grips on their controls. They had already defied galactic history once today. Now, they would have to do it again. The juggernauts adjusted their formations, their massive hulls shifting like mobile fortresses. These warships were humanity's answer to overwhelming force, but even they had never faced an adversary like this. Then the exterminators opened fire. No lasers, no railguns, not even antimatter warheads. Instead, gravity itself cracked. The enemy had long since abandoned conventional weaponry at this scale. Their planet killers relied on gravitational singularities, localized collapses of spacetime that shredded matter at a molecular level. The first wave of these attacks struck a section of the human fleet positioned near the battle's perimeter. One moment, they were there. 5 battleships, 2 destroyers, 3 escort cruisers. The next, they were gone. No explosions, no wreckage, just nothing. The exterminators didn't simply destroy their enemies. They erased them. And yet, humanity did not retreat. A lesser species would have panicked, would have attempted to scatter, to flee, to plead for mercy. But humanity was different. They had known extinction before. They had clawed their way back, from the brink time and time again, from wars that should have ended them, from disasters that should have consumed them. And now, standing on the edge of annihilation once more, they did what they had always done. They fought. The response was immediate. The Juggernauts activated their deepest failsafe protocols, systems designed for threats so cataclysmic that they had never before been deployed. Their onboard AI cores pulsed with activity, rerouting vast amounts of energy into experimental countermeasures. The first counterattack came in the form of planet crackers, weapons so devastating that their use was typically banned even in the most brutal human conflicts. Fusion cores housed within neutronium casings, designed to trigger controlled collapses of space-time. The only thing that had ever been powerful enough to counter a singularity was another singularity. And so, the Juggernauts fired. It wasn't a volley. It wasn't even a barrage. It was a calculated detonation of physics itself. The first impact struck one of the exterminators directly along its central axis. The resulting explosion didn't just damage it. It broke it. Reality itself twisted for a fraction of a second. And when the universe corrected itself, half of the enemy war machine had been replaced by an expanding sphere of crackling, fragmented space-time. The second and third detonations struck the remaining exterminators before they could fully reposition. One managed to activate emergency shielding, but the other was too slow. The gravitational rupture tore through its core, sending a shockwave across the battlefield so powerful that even the nearest human vessels had to divert power to shields just to remain intact. Yet, even as the exterminators faltered, the enemy's response was unrelenting. More warships poured into the system, thousands upon thousands of them, an unending tide of metal and fire. If the humans had struck fear into the enemy before, now they had enraged them. The Empire was no longer simply waging war. They were seeking revenge, and still, humanity did not back down. Admiral Callan's voice cut across the fleet-wide channels, calm, unwavering. We stand. No matter what comes next, no matter what they throw at us, we stand. Not one ship retreats, not one ship surrenders. This is where we make our line. This is where we hold the tide. Let them come. Across the fleet, across every remaining warship, there was no hesitation. Weapons powered up. Engines roared to life. And then, the final battle began. The moment Admiral Callan gave the order, humanity's war fleet surged forward, not as scattered formations of ships, but as a singular, unbreakable force. Each vessel, from the Titanic juggernauts to the swift and deadly strike cruisers, adjusted course with precision that could only be achieved by the flawless synchronization of human minds and machine intelligence. Every captain, every crew member, every soldier aboard those warships knew the stakes. There was no margin for hesitation, no room for doubt, because this was it, the final battle. Beyond them, the enemy's second wave had fully arrived. The destruction of their planet killers had only deepened their resolve, and now, the Empire was throwing everything they had into the void. Their formations stretched beyond the limits of the fleet's sensors, thousands upon thousands of warships, appearing like a vast storm rolling across the darkness of space. The human fleet was outnumbered, outgunned, but they were not outmatched. The first enemy formation surged ahead, breaking away from the main body of their armada, an overwhelming spearhead of dreadnoughts, heavy cruisers, and escort frigates, their hulls bristling with energy weapons and torpedo batteries. They moved in tight, calculated formations, their battle doctrines refined over centuries of conquest. They expected the human fleet to engage them in traditional combat. They expected the juggernauts to act as immobile fortresses, tanking the brunt of their assault, while smaller vessels maneuvered to strike. But that was not how humanity fought. The juggernauts did not simply hold the line. They became the line. With a single command from Admiral Callan, the massive warships surged forward. At full burn, their engines screaming against the void as they accelerated faster than anything their size should have been capable of. In an instant, the entire battlefield had changed. The enemy was expecting a siege. Instead, they got a battering ram. The first collision was devastating. The juggernaut Titan Wrath plowed through the enemy's vanguard line, like an unstoppable juggernaut of destruction, its reinforced hull shrugging off enemy fire as if it were nothing. Point defense turrets fired in all directions, swatting down torpedoes and strike craft before they could even come close. Then, the main guns fired. The Titan Wrath unleashed a salvo of kinetic impactors, hyper-dense projectiles accelerated to nearly the speed of light. Each shot struck with the force of a planet-shattering asteroid impact, ripping through enemy battleships like paper. The second juggernaut, Indomitable Fury, wasn't far behind. It activated its spinal-mounted plasma lance, a beam of superheated energy so intense it didn't just melt enemy warships, it disintegrated them. The first enemy dreadnought caught in its path barely had time to register the attack before it was reduced to a drifting cloud of vaporized metal and atmosphere. Humanity's war doctrine had never been about defense. It had always been about overwhelming offense. The enemy fleet scrambled to adjust. Thousands of their vessels began to reposition, moving to surround the juggernauts and cut off their momentum. Their capital ships unleashed waves of high-yield energy pulses, massive rippling arcs of destructive force meant to cripple the human advance. But they had made one fatal mistake. They had focused on the juggernauts. They had forgotten about the rest of the fleet. From the darkness of space, the second phase of the human assault commenced. Strike groups of stealth destroyers decloaked in perfect synchronization, emerging from hidden positions with deadly precision. Before the enemy fleet could react, they fired blackout torpedoes, specialized weapons designed to disrupt shields and sensor networks. Within seconds, the enemy's coordination crumbled. Their once organized formations began to drift, their targeting systems thrown into disarray, and that's when humanity struck with everything they had. The Wolfpack Doctrine. Human battlecruisers, frigates, and rapid assault corvettes surged forward, darting between enemy warships in a coordinated ballet of death. The enemy had always relied on raw firepower and superior numbers to overwhelm their opponents. But humanity was different. They fought like hunters. Each ship moved in perfect harmony, circling, flanking, striking in coordinated waves that left the enemy in utter disarray. Battleships that had once dominated the void were left vulnerable as smaller human vessels exploited weaknesses in their armor, unleashing tactical nukes at point-blank range. The battle became chaos. Enemy ships collided with each other as their targeting systems failed. Explosions rippled through their formations as human forces carved through their ranks. But even in their desperation, the enemy did not surrender. They could not. To them, humanity was an abomination, a species that should never have been able to stand against them. Their empire had conquered thousands of worlds, reduced countless civilizations to dust, and now here was humanity, a species that had barely been acknowledged in the galactic order, standing against the greatest force the universe had ever known, and worse, they were winning. The enemy fleet's high command realized this too late. The time they attempted a retreat, it wasn't an orderly withdrawal, it was a rout. Some of their warships turned and fled outright, burning hard for hyperspace in sheer terror. Others fought on, desperately trying to regroup, only to be cut down in waves by the relentless human assault. Admiral Callan watched it all unfold from the command deck of the Iron Resolve, his expression unreadable. He saw the enemy's flagship, at the center of the remaining armada, surrounded by the last remnants of their once mighty force. This was it, the final moment. A single command could end it. All remaining warships, focus fire on the flagship, Callan ordered, his voice calm, absolute. Across the fleet, thousands of human vessels turned their weapons on the final enemy warship, and then, a blinding storm of devastation erupted as every last gun in the human fleet fired at once. The enemy flagship vanished in a cataclysmic explosion, its remains scattering across the void in molten fragments. The Empire's leadership was no more. Their fleet was shattered. Their will was broken. The battle was over. But even as the enemy's remaining forces fled in terror, Callan knew one thing. This was not just a victory. This was a message. Humanity had not only survived, they had proven themselves. And now, the galaxy would never see them the same way again. Silence fell over the battlefield, or at least what remained of it. The once mighty Imperial Armada had been reduced to burning wreckage, shattered hulls drifting lifelessly across the void. Thousands of their warships had been obliterated in the span of hours, their proud formations reduced to scattered debris fields stretching light years across. Those that had survived had fled, their engines burning hot in a desperate retreat toward the nearest hyperspace lanes. They had come expecting conquest. They had left with nothing but devastation. On the bridge of the Iron Resolve, Admiral Callan stood motionless, watching as the enemy's final remnants vanished from his tactical display. The sensors showed only human ships now, moving methodically through the wreckage, confirming kills, retrieving survivors, and ensuring that no enemy vessel remained to threaten them. It was over, and yet, the weight of what had just occurred hung heavy in the silence. Humanity had fought wars before, battles of survival, conflicts that had shaped them into the warriors they were today. But this was something different. This was the moment. The galaxy itself had changed. A single distress call had been answered, and an entire empire had been shattered. Across the fleet, reports were coming in. Engineers were already moving through the remains of their own damaged vessels, sealing hull breaches and tending to the wounded. Medics worked tirelessly in the hangars, ships, and field hospitals, their hands stained with the blood of those who had given everything for this victory. The price had been high. Even among humanity's greatest war machines, not all had survived. The juggernaut Titan Wrath, the very ship that had led the charge into the enemy's ranks, had finally succumbed to its wounds. It now drifted silently, its mighty hull broken and torn apart, flames flickering in the void as surviving crew members scrambled to evacuate. Even as rescue shuttles moved in, Callan knew that many of them hadn't made it. The cost of war was always steep, but they had won. And now, the galaxy would never forget it. The first transmissions arrived before the last fires had even burned. Out across known space, alien civilizations, once content to remain silent in the shadow of the Empire, were watching. They had witnessed the impossible, a single species standing against the most powerful force in the galaxy, and winning. Some sent messages of awe, others of fear. Even those who had once dismissed humanity as nothing more than a minor power, now saw the truth. Humanity was not to be underestimated. Then came the final transmission. It was from the Empire's remaining forces, a desperate attempt at diplomacy in the wake of their crushing defeat. A message sent from the highest surviving. Admiral of their once great fleet, we surrender. The words echoed through the bridge. There was no arrogance now, no threats, no demands. Only the cold, undeniable truth. They had lost. They knew it, and more importantly, the galaxy knew it. Callan's expression remained unreadable. He stared at the message for a long moment before finally turning to his officers. Send them our response. The communications officer nodded, relaying the message across the vastness of space. Humanity's answer was simple. We were never your enemies. But, if you come for us again, we will end you. The war was over, but the echoes of this battle would ripple across the stars for generations to come. No longer was humanity just another name among the many species of the galaxy. They had been tested in fire. They had stood against the darkness, and, when the time came to choose, they had answered the call, with firepower, with unyielding resolve, with the full might of humanity. And now, the galaxy would never forget. Because the next time a distress call rang out into the void, everyone would know exactly who was coming.